Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that you specifically requested.
Oh, great.
Yeah, the fear flip strategy.
Okay.
We're diving into excerpts from the fear flip strategy, the only way of overcoming any fear,
Right,
a
yeah.
guide packed with advice and techniques.
Mhm.
Now, this might sound counterintuitive,
Okay.
but sticking your head in the sand and
Yeah.
avoiding your fears actually makes them stronger. We'll unpack the science behind that.
It's true. This guide lays out a fascinating 5-pillar strategy that blends neuroscience and psychology.
Okay.
It's called cognitive reframing, systematic desensitization, self-efficacy reinforcement,
Wow.
mindful acceptance, and post-fear growth.
5 pillars. That's quite a framework. I'm already curious to see how these pillars work together to actually make fear your ally instead of something to run from.
The core idea is to shift your relationship with fear,
Okay.
not eliminate it. Think of it as a springboard, not a roadblock.
Okay, so how do we start flipping the script? Let's start with cognitive reframing.
Okay.
I'm guessing this is where we challenge those worst-case scenario thoughts that fear loves to throw at us.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You're tapping into the power of your prefrontal cortex,
Okay.
the logical part of your brain,
Mm-hmm.
to fact-check your amygdala's alarm bells.
Okay.
Fear often starts with a story,
Mm-hmm.
a narrative that might not be entirely accurate.
I've definitely noticed that my fears tend to spiral into these catastrophic what-if scenarios.
Right.
Is there a technique to help untangle those thoughts?
The guide suggests something called the downward arrow technique.
Okay.
You ask yourself, if my fear came true, what would that mean about me?
Okay.
It helps uncover the deeper beliefs driving your fear.
Let's say I have a fear of public speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Asking that question might reveal a belief like I'm not good enough lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. And once you've identified that belief,
Okay.
you can start to challenge it.
Okay.
The guide suggests behavioral experiments, mini experiments in your own life,
Oh, okay.
to see if those fears actually hold up.
So instead of just staying stuck in my head,
Yeah.
I could actually test out my fear-based predictions.
Right.
If my fear is being judged during a presentation,
Mm-hmm.
maybe I could start by sharing my ideas in a smaller,
Right.
less intimidating setting.
Precisely. You might be surprised by the positive feedback you receive,
Okay.
which can chip away at that fear.
Okay.
It's like gathering evidence to debunk those fear-based narratives.
That makes a lot of sense. The guide also mentioned metacognitive awareness.
Right.
I'm not super familiar with that term.
It's simply noticing how you think about your thinking.
Okay.
Ever get caught in a spiral of worrying about your worry?
Oh, yeah.
That's what we want to interrupt.
Okay.
The guide encourages you to see anxiety as a temporary visitor,
Mm-hmm.
not a permanent resident.
So it's about recognizing that those anxious thoughts are just thoughts,
Yes.
not necessarily truths.
The guide shares a great story about Sarah, a lawyer with social anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
She decided to record herself speaking and then get feedback from colleagues.
Okay.
Their response: super positive.
Wow.
It directly contradicted her fear of being awkward or incompetent.
That's a fantastic example of how challenging those fear-based thoughts can lead to a completely different outcome than we expect.
And remember, just
Yeah.
like Sarah,
Mm-hmm.
everyone has their own unique fears and challenges.
Right.
The key is to find what works for you.
Okay, so we've tackled cognitive reframing.
Mm-hmm.
What's next in this fear-flipping journey?
The next pillar is systematic desensitization,
Mm-hmm. Oh,
which
okay.
sounds complex but boils down to this: avoiding what you fear only strengthens it.
Right.
The guide dives deep into how gradual exposure can help extinguish those fears over time.
So instead of running away, we're slowly dipping our toes into the fear pool.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And the guide provides a framework for that,
Oh.
building a personalized fear ladder.
Okay.
You rank situations that trigger your fear, starting with the least anxiety-provoking and
Yeah.
working your way up.
That's a great visual. So if I'm afraid of heights, I might start with standing on a step stool,
Right.
then progress to a higher platform.
Exactly.
It feels less overwhelming than immediately facing my biggest fear.
It's about taking those manageable steps
Right.
and building your confidence as you go.
Okay.
What's fascinating is that they even suggest using imaginal exposure,
Oh, okay.
especially for trauma-related fears.
Imaginal exposure. So instead of being thrown into the deep end,
Yeah.
you're visualizing the situation first.
Yeah.
I'm curious how that helps.
It allows you to process the fear in a safe space,
Okay.
guided by a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
This is particularly helpful for trauma survivors who might not be ready for immediate real-world exposure.
Okay.
It's about gently approaching the fear at a pace that feels safe.
It's like building up that mental muscle before tackling the physical challenge.
Yeah.
The guide also mentioned biofeedback tools.
Yeah.
I'm picturing something like a heart rate monitor.
You got it. It's a way to actually see your anxiety decrease in real time during exposure.
Oh, wow.
It's incredibly empowering to have that tangible proof that your body is calming down,
Okay.
even if your mind is still a bit hesitant.
It's like getting real-time feedback that your fear-fighting strategies are working. That's a great confidence booster.
Yeah.
I'm also curious about how this strategy applies to kids.
The guide has a fun tip for parents.
Okay.
Gamify exposure.
Oh, okay.
Turn it into a fear ladder challenge with rewards for each step.
I see.
Imagine a child afraid of water earning bravery points for dipping their toes in the pool,
Oh, okay.
then trading them for extra playtime.
Wow.
It's a creative way to make facing fears less daunting for kids.
That's brilliant. It takes the pressure off and turns it into a positive, rewarding experience. Okay, so we've explored cognitive reframing and systematic desensitization.
Right.
What's the next pillar in the fear flip strategy?
Welcome back to our deep dive into the fear flip strategy. Before we move on, I want to highlight something crucial about this entire approach. It leverages the interplay between the emotional and logical parts of our brain.
That makes sense. We've been talking about how our amygdala acts like an alarm system,
Right.
while the prefrontal cortex can step in to reassess those alarm bells.
Exactly. And the guide brilliantly explains how these two parts of the brain can work together to help us manage fear. It's not about ignoring our emotions or trying to force ourselves to be fearless.
Right.
It's about understanding those underlying processes and working with them.
It sounds like we're training our brains to respond to fear in a more balanced and helpful way.
Yeah.
And one of the key takeaways for me so far is that knowledge is power. Simply understanding the science behind fear already feels less intimidating.
I agree. And the guide doesn't just stop at explaining the science.
Right.
It provides practical tools and techniques that we can put into practice.
Okay.
Remember that fear ladder we talked about? Yeah. Have you ever considered creating one for yourself?
Actually, yes. I've always had a bit of a fear of public speaking.
Okay.
It feels daunting to imagine myself giving a big presentation. But thinking about it as a ladder with smaller steps leading up to that goal makes it seem much more manageable.
That's a great example. Perhaps your first step could be practicing your presentation in front of a mirror, then with a close friend, and gradually working your way up to larger groups.
Okay.
The key is to start small and celebrate those wins along the way.
Small steps and big celebrations. I like that. It takes the pressure off of trying to conquer the fear all at once.
Exactly. And the guide reminds us that progress isn't always linear.
Right.
There will be setbacks and moments of doubt.
Okay.
But each time you face that fear, even in a small way, you're rewiring your brain and building resilience.
It's a reminder that setbacks are not failures. They're just part of the process.
Speaking of rewiring the brain, let's dive deeper into systematic desensitization.
Okay.
Specifically, the concept of exposure therapy. It might sound intimidating at first,
Okay.
but it's incredibly effective.
I'm familiar with the general idea of exposure therapy.
Okay.
But can you explain how it works in practice?
The basic principle is that by repeatedly and safely exposing ourselves to the things we fear, we can gradually reduce our anxiety response.
Right.
The guide explains how our brains can actually learn to recognize that the feared object or situation is not truly dangerous.
So it's about retraining our brains to respond differently to those triggers.
Precisely. The guide mentions a fascinating study where people with a fear of spiders underwent exposure therapy.
Okay.
They started with simply looking at pictures, then watching videos,
Right.
then being in the same room as a spider,
Okay.
and eventually even holding a spider.
Wow, that's a pretty intense example. But I'm guessing it worked.
It did. Over time,
Okay.
their fear response significantly decreased. Their heart rate and sweating subsided,
Okay.
and they reported feeling much less anxious around spiders.
Interesting.
The exposure therapy literally changed their brain's response to the feared stimulus.
That's incredible. It really highlights how powerful this approach can be. Now, I know exposure therapy can sound daunting, especially if you're dealing with intense fears.
Right.
Is it safe for everyone?
That's a great question. The guide emphasizes the importance of finding the right pace for you and working with a qualified therapist who can guide you through the process safely and effectively. They would help assess your individual needs and tailor the approach accordingly.
That makes sense. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
The guide mentioned different types of exposure therapy. We touched on imaginal exposure earlier. Can you remind me what that is?
Of course. Imaginal exposure involves vividly imagining the feared situation in a safe environment with a therapist's guidance. It's especially helpful for trauma-related fears, as it allows you to process the trauma and reduce its emotional impact without immediately confronting the actual trigger.
That's a gentler approach for those who might not be ready for real-world exposure. It's like dipping your toes in the water before taking the plunge.
Exactly. The guide also discusses interoceptive exposure, which is specifically for panic disorder.
That one sounds a little counterintuitive. Can you explain it?
It involves intentionally triggering the physical sensations that often accompany a panic attack. Like hyperventilation or dizziness.
Interesting.
The goal is to help you decouple those sensations from the catastrophic thoughts, like I'm having a heart attack, that often fuel the panic.
So it's about learning that those physical sensations, while uncomfortable, aren't dangerous in themselves.
Exactly. And the guide suggests using coping skills like paced breathing or grounding techniques during exposure to manage the anxiety and build that sense of mastery. It's like having a toolkit to help navigate those challenging moments.
It's all about reclaiming that sense of control rather than feeling overwhelmed by those sensations.
You know, one thing I find particularly inspiring about the fear flip strategy is that it doesn't stop at just coping with fear. It's about using that energy, that discomfort, as a catalyst for growth.
That's what really sets this strategy apart. It's not just about surviving fear. It's about thriving in spite of it.
Yes. The guide talks about post-fear growth. This idea that overcoming challenges can lead to profound personal transformation. It reframes fear as a signpost, pointing us toward areas where we need to grow and evolve.
It's like those experiences, even the scary ones, can shape us into more resilient and wholehearted versions of ourselves.
And the guide brilliantly compares fear recovery to physical fitness. Because we work out, our muscles get sore. But that soreness is a sign of growth, a sign that we're getting stronger. In the same way, the discomfort of facing our fears can be a sign that we're stretching our limits and developing resilience.
That's a great analogy. It reminds us that growth often happens outside of our comfort zones.
And remember, the guide emphasizes that setbacks are an inevitable part of the process. It's not about being perfect. It's about learning from our stumbles. They even suggest reframing the word relapse as data.
Interesting.
If you experience a setback instead of beating yourself up, you view it as valuable information that can help you adjust your strategy.
That's a much more empowering way to look at it. It takes away the shame and allows us to approach setbacks with curiosity and a growth mindset.
The guide also highlights the power of storytelling, of sharing our journey with others who have faced similar challenges. It can be incredibly validating to hear other people's stories of resilience and realize we're not alone.
There's something so comforting about knowing that others have walked a similar path and come out stronger on the other side.
Exactly. And finally, the guide encourages celebrating courage and effort, regardless of the outcome. Did you try something new, even if it felt scary? Did you speak up for yourself, even if your voice was shaking? Those are victories worth acknowledging and celebrating.
It's about recognizing those small wins and honoring the courage it took to take those steps.
Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to touch on something important. The guide reminds us that fear doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's influenced by our unique experiences, our cultural backgrounds, and even our biology.
That makes sense. Our individual context plays a huge role in how we experience and respond to fear.
Exactly. And they talk about the need for cultural humility. Recognizing that different cultures have different norms and values around fear and courage. What might be considered brave in one culture could be seen as reckless in another.
It's about respecting those differences and understanding that there's no single right way to approach fear.
And when it comes to trauma, they stress the importance of trauma-informed care.
Right.
prioritizing safety and stability above all else. For someone who has experienced trauma,
Right.
the initial focus might be on developing grounding techniques and establishing a sense of safety before exploring exposure therapy.
It's about meeting people where they are and creating a safe and supportive environment for healing.
And finally, they acknowledge that medication can play a role in managing severe anxiety.
Okay.
For some people, medication can help reduce the intensity of their anxiety symptoms,
Right.
making it easier to engage in therapy and other behavioral techniques.
It's about finding the right combination of tools and strategies that work best for each individual.
So, as we've seen, the fear flip strategy is a nuanced approach that takes into account the complexity of fear and the unique needs of each person.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring this amazing strategy for not just managing fear, but actually flipping it into a force for growth.
Yeah.
It's called the fear flip strategy, and it's been really eye-opening to see how it combines science with practical techniques.
What's resonating with me is how this strategy doesn't try to make us into fearless robots.
Right.
You know, it acknowledges that fear is a natural part of being human.
Yeah.
It's about learning to dance with fear.
Okay.
Not pretend it doesn't exist.
That's such a great way to put it. Dancing with fear. Instead of letting it lead, we're learning to move with it, to acknowledge its presence without letting it control us.
The guide emphasizes that fear is often a signal, not a stop sign.
Okay.
It might be pointing us towards an area where we need to grow,
Okay.
a boundary we need to set,
Right.
or a value we need to uphold.
So it's like fear is a compass guiding us toward those areas of our lives where we need to pay attention and perhaps make some changes.
Right.
And sometimes those changes might feel scary, but they could lead to something amazing.
Absolutely. The guide reminds us that even small acts of courage can have a ripple effect throughout our lives. Each time we face a fear, we're breaking down a barrier and creating more space for ourselves to grow and evolve.
It's like we're expanding our comfort zones little by little and opening up possibilities we might never have imagined.
And that's where the real magic happens.
Right.
The guide talks about post-fear growth.
Okay.
The idea that overcoming challenges can lead to a deeper understanding of ourselves,
Right.
a stronger sense of purpose, and a greater appreciation for life.
It's like those experiences, even the tough ones, have the power to shape us into more resilient, compassionate, and authentic versions of ourselves.
The guide also suggests that facing our fears can actually help us connect more deeply with others.
Okay.
When we share our vulnerabilities, our struggles, and our triumphs, it creates a space for genuine connection and empathy.
That resonates with me. It's like those shared experiences.
Yeah.
Those moments of vulnerability can create bonds that are stronger than any fear.
The guide also emphasizes seeking support when facing our fears, whether it's from a therapist, a support group, or trusted friends and family.
Yeah.
Having a network of people who understand and believe in us can make all the difference.
It's a reminder that we don't have to go through this alone. There are people who care about us, who want to see us thrive, and who are there to support us every step of the way.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the fear flip strategy, I want to leave you with this thought from the guide. Fear is a kind of storytelling we tell ourselves.
I love that. It makes me think about the stories I've been telling myself about my fears.
What stories are you telling yourself? Are they stories of limitation, of powerlessness, of inevitable defeat? Or can you start to rewrite those narratives?
Wow.
Can you envision yourself as the hero of your own story, capable of facing challenges, overcoming obstacles, and emerging stronger on the other side?
That's such an empowering thought. It's a reminder that we have the power to choose the stories we tell ourselves and to create a life that is aligned with our deepest values and aspirations.
Remember, fear is a natural part of life, but it doesn't have to define you. You have the power to flip the script, to transform your relationship with fear, and to use it as a catalyst for growth, resilience, and a more fulfilling life.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fear flip strategy.
Of course.
I hope you feel equipped to start flipping your own fears and writing a new story for yourself. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep growing.